Hello everyone, greetings from Hong Kong. It's indeed 11 p.m. here and probably too late for the Aussies and the Kiwis down under. I hope you're all safe and healthy. Welcome back and thank you for joining us. Today we are going to deep dive again and revisit HDMI 2.1. And that's a great timing because many HDMI cable manufacturers are about to release a wide variety of ultra high-speed cables for the upcoming 8K content. So we're going to discuss the latest advancement with special guests from AudioQuest. Time for some introductions. Joining us today are Frédéric Pinsonneau, Regional Sales Manager based in Montreal, Canada, and Isaac Markowitz, AudioQuest's Ambassador at Aspirational Audio, based in Colorado's Greater Denver area. Morning, gentlemen, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Good morning, Frédéric.
Greetings and salutations, everyone. Good to see you.
As usual, behind the scene is our lovely Jennifer, based in Rancho Bernardo near San Diego. Without her, we would not have webinars. We also have our legacy expert, Jim, and he's joining us from Minnesota. And I'm Frédéric, I'm joining you from Hong Kong. Together, we'll keep an eye on the incoming questions and we'll try our best to get them all answered live during the session. I am going to hand it over now to our host and training guru, Phil, who is joining us from his office in Carlsbad. Over to you, Phil.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. It's Phil and the gang, and we're here to talk about a very popular topic, HDMI 2.1. When we did these at the beginning of the year, we had lots and lots of questions from lots of people, and a lot of questions we really couldn't answer because no one made a cable yet. So we were talking about what could happen and what probably might happen and how you would probably get good quality from this new HDMI standard, but we didn't really have very many examples to show you. So what we want to do is revisit the topic, answer some of those questions, and give you an update about kind of the status or the state of this HDMI 2.1 thing. And who else would be a great addition to this conversation? AudioQuest. So joining me are two of my favorite people, Fred and Isaac. We hang out a lot at these big trade shows like CD and stuff like that. I can't tell you how many times at 1 o'clock in the morning or on a Sunday night, Jim or I go over to their booth and plead for another HDMI cable or RCA cable to get one of our systems up. AudioQuest is the leader when it comes to high quality cables. In fact, Isaac, why don't you give them a real quick recap of who you guys are?
You know, we were founded in 1980 by Bill O, so we are celebrating 40 years, which is really, really exciting, with one guiding philosophy, which is do no harm. So Bill realized early on that all cables add noise and distortion, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. And so the golden, or rather the holy grail of building the best cable in the world was approaching no theoretical cable. Now, let's keep in mind, that's not wireless. It's not quite the same thing, but we have been searching for this elusive goal of a perfect cable that is no cable ever since.
Exactly. And like I said, your cables, you do pay a premium for an AudioQuest cable. And Isaac and Frederick are going to show you that as we go along. But we're going to break this down into a couple of sections because the first thing we're going to talk about is what is this HDMI 2.1 thing? What is it? What's the benefits? What's the bandwidth requirements? After that, then we're going to get into what's inside of these cables and how the heck do they get this much data down an HDMI cable that looks almost like the one you had in your system today. And then finally, we're going to go in and Isaac and Fred are going to talk about what do they do differently in their HDMI cables that make them cost a premium so you can make an educated decision about that and understand what's going on inside the box. So this came up because I've done lots of webinars on long distance HDMIs, but we were looking for, I'm always running around looking for a good 48 gigahertz supported HDMI cables. And Isaac said, hey, I got something for you. So we scheduled this meeting to talk about these cables. So Frederick, what are you guys introducing? You guys introducing a new lineup of cables. Can you just give us a real quick recap about what you're getting ready to introduce?
Sure. So we have a new line called HDMI 48. 48 is for that 48 gigabit per second support. A lot of the names, so for those that already own AudioQuest cable, we're reusing a lot of the model names because there's a big following. So Pearl, Forest, Cinnamon, Carbon, Vodka remain. We have a few new things that Isaac will talk in a little bit, but they are designed now to support 48 gigabit per second.
Mhm.
The cable has the same number of conductors, but the new HDMI 2.1 spec changed a few things and reassigned some data channels to make that 48 gig possible from the current 18 gigabit.
Exactly. So the nice thing about it is um, we're going to go in and explain the inside of these cables, but what I like is the fact that they put 48 on the box. A lot of times people will dance around a subject without giving you the real facts. Like before, when I was running around and looking for HDMI cables for HDR 5 or 6 years ago, they would tell me about 444 and 4K, but they would never give me a number. Why? Because I could bend the number. I can give you 444. I can give you HDR with lousy color at high frame rate, and have a lower number. But if they hit 18, that meant that I was going to get all of the capabilities of a 4K Blu-ray. So when you see 48 on a box, that tells you that it hits the speed limit, the top speed, the maximum bandwidth that the HDMI format can support. And so look for the number 48. It needs to be on the box somewhere to tell you that you're getting the real deal. Don't just look at 8K. Don't just look at 4K 120. Look for the number 48 because that tells you what the bandwidth speed is. And inside, and like you said, there's two versions. There's the old Vodka, and then there's the Vodka 48. And we'll talk about what's going on because in here we'll cover these things a little bit later about the tighter tolerances, the signal delivery, and the better noise dissipation, which is why they can shove more data down copper than they could a few years ago. So the first thing is let's talk about why this 48 is important, because we get asked a lot about 48. And each time there's a new standard, it's mostly because you need more bandwidth for video, just the way it is. If you look at before, when we were talking about HD or 4K, 10 gigabits per second was all that you need. When we went to HDMI 2.0, which was for 4K 60 HDR, you need about 18. Fred, why do you need 48?
Well, once you go beyond that 4K 60 you just talked about, so if you go to 8K 24 frames being, the cinema look, the movies are usually done at 24 frames. There'll be some video at 25 and 30 depending on what region of the world you're in. But 8K 24 goes from, so 4K 24 is about 11 gigs, a little above the 1.4 threshold. But then the ceiling goes up, and 8K 24 is 32 gig. And now if you want to get to 8K 60, 4K 120 in 10-bit, you're at 40 gig. And even if you want to get to 12-bit, and of course, and Phil and I talked about it all the time, there's no 12-bit panels out there. There's no 12-bit content. There are a few cameras out there, but they're few and far between. That's where that ceiling of 48 comes from, is to do 4K 120, 8K 60 in 12-bit video. So the video exponentially, the demand for bandwidth is exponential as soon as you get to 8K and 4K 120.
Exactly. And this is an important chart that they provided. And I've showed you guys charts like this before. 48 is the maximum speed limit. It does not mean today on a modern display watching what you're probably going to watch, you're going to need 48. So for example, us movie buffs like our movies at 24p. Fred and Isaac are both like cinema guys. They like their cinematic movies, and they're gone, and their Lawrence of Arabia's and their stuff like that. Well, that is shot at 24p to give it this cinematic look. You can shoot it faster, but then you actually see, the set being held up by a stick, because there's so much extra resolution. Directors use blur in a movie because it looks really good and it hides bad scenes and bad you have your what do they call those guys, the ones that the soldiers that just die randomly in a movie. Extras. Yeah. You'll see that the extra has a glued on nose at 60p or 120 frames per second because it's so sharp. I can get away with that at 24. So 24 is chosen because people like the way it looks for movies. And then so even if they shoot in 8K, the shoe is still going to probably deliver that movie and that cinematic look at 24, and you only need 32. The 120 frames per second is probably for gamers who want that smoother gaming action, or can you imagine Fred watching a hockey game at 120 frames per second? Wouldn't that
Yeah,
be
now
amazing?
if only the local team could win a Stanley Cup in this decade, that'd be even better.
Hey man, I'm from I'm from SoCal. I got the Chargers, so I know exactly how you feel.
Hey, at least
All
we're not the Leafs is from the 60s. The Montreal at least had a Stanley Cup in my lifetime.
exactly. So the hockey puck is crisp, the football is smooth, and they still lose. But that's okay. But yeah, so 120 frames per second. Like I said, I think they were going to do the Olympics, right? You guys mentioned they were
Yep.
thinking about doing the Olympics in these higher.
Tokyo was going to have a few demo and probably the 100-meter dash or the big events. We're going to do an 8K. The Japanese market, as you know, has got the advantage of broadcast in 8K is possible because it's done over the air without compression. We'll see next year what happens, but hopefully we can get some of that cool footage. A 100-meter dash would be really cool.
At 120 frames per second.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but one thing we want to get across too is even when we talk about 8K or we talk about 120 frames per second 4K, your TV is like Fred said, is only a 10-bit panel. All TVs, all projectors that you can buy currently use a 10-bit panel. I don't care what brand, what model. If you to give it the maximum amount of colors, which I believe is what 1 billion. Which is what you can get from a 10-bit panel, you only need 40. Whether you're using 8K, whether you're watching 8K 60 or 4K 120, 40 is the maximum that panel can support. The 48 is there for 12-bit devices, as well as can you exceed 8K when it comes utilizing this standard, Frederick?
Yeah, so that's one cool that's been implemented in the Spec 2.1 is display stream compression. That technology already exists in the PC world with DisplayPort, but basically means that if we have 8K 120 16-bit, something that doesn't exist right now, but the bandwidth is greater than 48, you'll be able to do a lossless compression at the send and then a lossless decompression at the receive. So that new standard is there to last because there's a way, there's no ceiling. So that 18 gig ceiling we had in 2.0 doesn't really exist in 2.1 because of DSC.
Exactly.
Is it future proof? I hate using that word. If you're in electronics, stuff's changed really, really quickly. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we had big fat TVs made of glass. Now they're paper thin. Things will always change. But DSC will, if you have a cable that's ran in the wall, that's captive, that can't be changed, or if your just budget doesn't allow this year for a change, you'll be able to watch your content with DSC for the years to come.
Yeah, and that's an important point. People ask all the time, I always say my philosophy is always buy once if possible, buy once, cry once if possible, right? So the nice thing about the HDMI 2.1 standard is with this DSC compression, it can support up to 10K 120 and 12-bit panels, which neither exist.
Which are science fiction right now.
But it will support it. So hopefully we will not be having this conversation for a long period of time. There is something that I do want to point out that's important about this DSC. Our receivers support 140 gigabit input because that's the maximum that your display can support, and 2 outputs. But sometimes people say, well, why did you just use 1 input? I heard that there's another brand that's using that's less expensive, that has multiple ends, 3 or 4 ends, and 1 out. Why can they do that and you cannot? And yours do not have that. That is because there's basically two different chipsets you can buy for an AVR. The more expensive high-end one supports 40 gigabits per second in, and you can have either 2 in or 1 out. We chose to use 1 in and 2 out instead because of those people who are probably going to step up to a high-end projector. The other one that has multiple inputs can support up to 24, and then it applies DSC compression to pass it. So will it pass 8K 60? Yes. Will it pass 4K 120? Yes. Is it officially an HDMI 2.1 solution? Yes, but it's passing it using compression, okay? 24. So 3 or 4 24 gigabit inputs, and it uses compression. All the display devices that are 2.1 have to be able to decode DSC. And all of the sources have to be able to encode in DSC. And all receivers or repeaters have to be able to pass the DSC signal. So remember, not all 8K is the same, just like not all HDMI cables are the same. So just because you see more inputs, there's a catch. All right. So think about that. There is a catch. We do uncompressed 8K and 4K 120 for your display. They are already resorting to the compression. Now, what ends up happening is you can only compress it so much. If you start talking about the 10K stuff and the 12-bit panel stuff, you can't compress it down to 24. So ours will be able to support insane amounts of resolution and an insane amount of colors, where theirs is probably going to hit a limit. So that's one of the reasons why we picked the solution that we picked. And that's an important point that I want to get across to you. Now we're going to talk more about this bandwidth and 48 and how do you take a cable that used to be 18 and turn it into and make it not magically with a lot of hard work, which I was going to say, don't call it magic. You know, it took us a lot of thought to make that happen. But how did they do that? But first, you want to talk about the other things the other benefits you get from HDMI 2.1. Many of us are not going to rush out and buy a 8K TV, or even are going to go out and buy or even care about 4K 120. If I'm a movie buff and I'm not playing games, I may not care about that. I may be a game guy and still not care about it. So there's some other benefits to HDMI 2.1 that we want to stress. Why you want it now? What benefits are you going to get for something like maybe a projector or a TV that is not an 8K TV? So let's go through and recap some of these. The first thing is dynamic HDR. So, gentlemen, what's the benefit of dynamic HDR versus, the SDR or regular static HDR?
So it's a great question. And obviously the conversation with video is always resolution, but contrast probably is more important. Both of you wear glasses at a certain distance, that small difference in resolution might go away. But contrast is what makes something lifelike, makes it look real and not flat. And the previous video standard, we're using SDR, standard dynamic range, which had about a 6 f-stop range. So f-stops, for those that know photography, is that that iris that opens in your SLR lens, but it really means exponentially twice as much light at every stop. HDR can do 17 stops, so the power of 17 instead of the power of 6 between the darkest and lightest point. It's set at the beginning of the file, so the beginning of the movie, beginning of the TV show. So it doesn't readjust dynamically. And the scene that we see on screen, I just light that campfire, the sun's going down, so my fire's going to get brighter, the background's going to get darker. It doesn't really readjust. The other example I like is Batman. Batman is wearing his black bat suit in front of his black Batmobile in the Batcave, but then the next scene, he's Bruce Wayne wearing a light tan suit in the streets of Gotham City. So dynamic HDR readjusts that on the fly. Technologies are called Dolby Vision or HDR10 Plus or HLG, but really it is that readjustment of the lowest and highest value throughout the film dynamically. That's really cool. It's possible in current technology, but the Spec 2.1 includes dynamic HDR. Before it was working, but it was not supported officially.
Yeah, it was an option. It was optional.
Now
it's required. Okay.
Yeah.
So as Frederick was saying, stops is basically how much is two things. The difference, the greatest difference between the darkest thing that the camera can capture and the brightest. Okay. And your eyes could see more than what a standard camera could capture. So if you went into Times Square, I could see the detail of someone in the shadows wearing a gray jacket, yet all the neon signs were bright, bright colors. A camera has to choose when it comes to SDR. Do I want to capture all of that information in the shadows and all of the neon gets blown out to like white? Or do I want all of those vibrant colors in the neon, but then I can't see anything in the shadows because there wasn't enough range when it comes to brightness. With HDR, now you have enough range that you can capture all that information in the shadows and all that information in the bright areas. Now, your TVs just unfortunately do not have the capability of displaying all of this information. We're just now starting to see TVs. You'll see most content, they measure it in nits. Is shot either at 0 to 1,000, which an OLED cannot do, period. 0 to 4,000, which is only maybe 2 LCD TV, consumer LCDs in existence that can do that, or 0 to 10,000, which nothing can do. Okay, so what ends up happening is because your TV cannot reproduce all of that brightness, it has to basically look at the content and based on the information provided in the content, try to adjust itself to get you the most. With static, they only give the TV one piece of information: the brightest pixel in the movie, and what is the brightness, the average brightness of the brightest frame in the movie. So say I'm watching something like this. This is Blade Runner. What year? I don't want to mess it up because Fred knows.
2049.
2049. So this is Blade Runner 2049. And if I look at this one and I say, make believe this is the brightest frame in the movie. And I say, this is the brightest frame, and there's a pixel way off in the distance. That is the brightest pixel. And I provide just that information to the TV or the projector, and it tries to adjust all its parameters to make this one scene look good. If I go to a dark scene, those numbers are way off. So the dark scene seems darker and it doesn't have as much shadow detail. The colors are not as rich. So I need to provide, so dynamic HDR, each frame or each scene, that information is now provided to the TV so it can make a better educated decision to optimize its performance. The next thing I want to point out too was Fred was right. The human eye is more sensitive to color and contrast than it is resolution. If you guys are watching this on a computer, get up, walk back about 12 feet and look at these two images. You can still notice a difference between these two images from across the room. I guarantee you can't see the resolution difference. So a lot of times the color and the contrast is going to be far more noticeable to the human eye. Now, when it comes to dynamic HDR, by the way, it can support Dolby Vision, which is proprietary. It can support HDR 10 Plus, which is proprietary, or it can support a generic version of dynamic HDR. So think of it this way. Dolby Vision is Coca-Cola. HDR 10 is Pepsi-Cola. Dynamic HDR, standard dynamic HDR, is the white can that just says cola along the outside. So it can support all the third party plus a universal version of it as well. For you as a customer, if you have a TV that supports this and you have a receiver that can pass this and you have a display that can show this, you're just going to get the best picture from all HDR content you're watching, and that's what that matters. So HDR, of course, is available now, and you're going to benefit from that, whether you're watching a movie, playing a game, looking at sports. It doesn't matter. That's something that everybody's going to benefit from, right?
Mm-hmm.
The next thing is, while we talk about 8K, there's also this high frame rate. So Frederick, talk about a little bit about this high frame rate. We talked for a second about it earlier.
Yeah, so 24 frames is what's been used in cinema for over 100 years, because it was the least amount of frames that you could use for the illusion of movement, because film was a bunch of photos that changed really, really fast, and film stock was expensive. So budget-wise, they went to the smallest amount. With video, there's less restriction that way, and we can get to 60 frames, even 120 frames. There have been a few movies with a high frame rate. You know, the Hobbit trilogy was done at 48. Gemini Man with Will Smith last year was done at 120, but the displays weren't ready in your home to do this yet. We saw high frame rate in the PC gaming world, but that's about it. Now you can do 4K 60 and even 4K 120 in the new standard, and that just gives you a more lifelike image because there's more image in the same second. For video games means that you get faster input, so what you're doing happens faster on screen. And for sports, well, we get that crisper image that Phil was talking about. So you're trying to catch the ball, try to see what the player's doing. Obviously, you're not going to see every baseball game or every golf game at 4K 120 right away. What's used also, some cameras will do high frame rate, but reduce it for slow motion. So if you see an instant replay that's really, really sharp, I think the NHL is probably the best because they got the bit of a budget for production value. That's why you get those really, really cool slow motion that a few years ago looked kind of blurry and didn't look really good because cameras are capable of doing that. I mean, your iPhone can shoot at 4K 60 now in Dolby Vision if you got the new 12 today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of hockey games, a lot of football games, a lot of major league sports is actually shot either in 8K 60 or 4K 120 right now. And they use it for either, like you said, slow motion, or did the person step out of bounds? And on your HD TV, you go, man, they zoomed into like you can read Nike on his shirt, on his shoe, because guess what? It's shot in 8K and all, but they're not delivering it in 8K, and they can zoom all the way in order to give you that to give you that impression. Now, one thing we want to point out about this 4K 120, yes. You're hearing that there's going to be games in 4K 120, and there's these two systems coming out that can play games in 4K 120. 48 is the maximum that the thing can support. When it comes to 4K 120 on a gaming system like the upcoming Xbox and the upcoming PlayStation, it can play games. It can deliver a frame rate up to 120 frames per second. It doesn't mean that every frame in the game that you're playing is going to be delivered at 120 frames per second. There's another thing we're going to talk about, the second, called variable refresh rate. And because of that, I'll show you as we go through this that there will be times when you're watching that game, you're playing that game, or I'm standing here behind a white background and I'm fighting somebody, and it's not a lot that the computer has to draw, and you'll get it at 120 frames per second. If I'm fighting somebody in the middle of New York City and there's cars driving by and there's neon signs behind me and there's people driving around, there is no way that game system can draw all of that at that frame rate, and it's going to reduce. So it will, at times, your games will get up to 120 frames per second. It does not mean that the entire game is going to be played back at 120 frames per second. So that leads us to this variable refresh rate thing. Fred, why don't you talk about this variable refresh rate real quick?
Sure. So, and I think you put it great. So certain games, depending on what's going, if there's a cinematic, it might show it at 24p because it's going to look very cinematic and movie-like. But then when the action shows up and the big bad boss, the game might speed up to 60 frame or even 120 if needed. Or the opposite, if there's too many guys on screen and the processor can't keep up, it might throttle the frame rate to keep the graphics. Games will even have settings that you can have a high frame rate with graphics not as good, or the beautiful graphics with ray tracing, where you'll get a solid 120, or you'll get the variable refresh rate up to 120. So you get the choice depending on what your gear can do and what the game can do. The first content you'll see to hit that 4K 120 is actually going to be older games. There's backwards compatibility on those consoles. So the first 3 Halo games are getting an upgrade with the new Xbox. Those will be in 4K 120, but it's also original Xbox graphics. Doesn't have those beautiful shadows and textures and ray tracing.
Exactly.
But it's going to be very crisp. And for a shooter game, if you see faster than I see, so if I'm playing against Isaac and I'm at 120 frames, I might hit him before he hits me because I'm just seeing more information than he can. So that's what those features are for. For the really beautiful demo, yeah, you might be at 30 frames, you might be at 60 frames, depending on the game.
Exactly. So a computer has a limited amount of processing power. Do I spend it on drawing frames really fast? Do I draw the frames with a lot more detail? Or do I draw the frames with a lot, like we call resolution? Or do I add more detail? Like, for example, I can do, there's this thing called ray tracing. Ray tracing is all the shadows and stuff that makes the game look more like the real world. That is really hard to do. So a lot of times a ray traced HD game will look better than a non-ray traced 4K game. So you have to balance. Do I want functionality and detail like ray tracing, resolution, 4K, 8K, HD, or frame rate? All right. You're not going to get super high ray traced 4K, 120 frames per second on a really detailed scene. It's just not going to happen. So a lot of the TV, when I saw this demonstration done at CES last year, they actually had you could bring up on the TV on one of the display monitors the actual frame rates, and you will see it hit 120 every once in a while, and then drop back down to 30, and then 48 and 25. It moved around based on the demand of that particular frame or that particular scene in the movie. So 4K 120 games does not mean continuous 4K 120. All right. So I want to get that across. Now I'm going to actually disappear for a second, and while I disappear, I'm going to ask Jim and Frederick out in the Netherlands, hiding out in the shadows right now, if we have any questions.
We do actually have a question, but I think it's on a topic that we're going to get to later. It's from Vamsi, and he's asking about the bit rate to a 10-bit panel, 4K at 120, 444 color.
Hold my chart while we were talking. I think that will be 40 gig, Vasmi. So I think you're right. The one thing, and Phil has a great explanation on 444. There's not a lot of content that's 444. So you might see those numbers 420, 422, 444. 444 being the original pixel, so the luminance and chroma, but it's always compressed. Any movies you'll buy, any game you'll buy will be in 420, and then the TV is extrapolating this. And extrapolating is a nice word for guessing. It's what computers do. They guess really, really well. But if you set your source in 444, they have a really, really good Blu-ray player. You've got, one of the big Panasonic, one of the original Oppo. There's a couple of, very spectacular player out there. They'll have good processors. They're good guessers, but they're extrapolating, and you're making that container bigger for absolutely no reason. Now, if it's a movie and you're at 24 frames, well, you may pass the 18 gigabit ceiling, and if you've got a 48 gig cable, that's fine. As if you have a previous generation cable, that's where you got into trouble, and that's where you would have problem and call the person that sold you the system or installed the system, say, hey, my stuff doesn't work. I'm like, yeah, you've turned on a setting that makes the container huge when the information is smaller. 444 is really, really handy for somebody using a monitor for PC for text. Because if you do that compression on text, you're going to see those little weird colors around black letters. So guys that use their TVs as PC monitors want to set 444. And again, that higher ceiling of 48 will help you. And then you got the SC. If you go over over the edge, it's just going to compress to 48, and it's going to be seamless to you. You're not going to see that.
Additionally, the reality is there's very few things that are sources that you want to do the upscaling, correct? So if you're using it as a computer,
Apple TV, a $300, game consoles, they're not great processor. If you spend a few grand on your Blu-ray player and your TV might be older, sure, try it. It doesn't hurt. But you may hit the ceiling if you have an 18 gig cable, and you may want to switch to a 48 gig solution for that.
Yeah. And touching on processing, one of the pieces that I think is really important, and we'll talk a little bit about this in minimizing noise and distortion, but these devices are optimally working with little to no processing. The goal is to get all the information there with this little interpolation, another fancy engineering term that means guessing. We're trying to avoid that. So anything that gets that information there that also reduces the amount of work that any one processor has to do is going to give you the smoothest, most lifelike picture.
Yeah.
Yep.
I compare it to traction control on your car. It's great to have it when you need it, but if the road's smooth and there's no snow and your traction control is not working or your ABS not working, it's better.
Yeah, and now you brought up a good point. And we're going to talk about don't make it bigger just because you can a little bit later. That's one of the tips that we always put up. What lives on a Blu-ray is only 420. What they broadcast is only 420. If you're seeing all the colors, you're seeing 444. Something had to take the 420 and make it 444 that's on that Blu-ray disc. Do you want to be a $100 Blu-ray player or an $8,000 TV? Okay, that's the first thing. A computer is different. Like he was saying, graphics. The computer makes the drawing. It's whatever the computer wants it to be. So when you're writing text or you're doing text and the computer is generating the text or generating the object, it can generate 444 because it's making it from scratch, you know? So that's kind of the difference. If I took a video of a PowerPoint at 420 and I played that PowerPoint video back through my PC, I would still see all of the errors that he had talked about in the text. It's just when the computer is generating it itself that it can actually do 444. So 444 is a great thing, but it is the last thing that you need to be concerned with when it comes to a display. Because the thing you need to be concerned with most is the bit depth of your content. That is what matters. That is what gives you colors. If I bring up these two things, one is 444, one is 422. The 8-bit 444 is substantially bigger than the 10-bit 422 because I am sampling every color every single time instead of sampling one portion of the color all the time and the other portions half the time. The computer's smart enough. If I tell you 1 plus X equals 4, I know that X is 3. It's not hard mathematics for these displays to actually do. I could end up, would you rather have 16 million colors or 1 billion colors in a smaller file? 1 billion. So a lot of times, so 444 is the last thing you chase. You want the maximum bit depth, 10. Don't even bother with 12 because the TV can't use it anyway. Start with 10, then you can start with the 444 and the 420s and playing with that. You want the maximum color depth because that is what is going to make a difference between what you see, and it's going to make the file size smaller. If you get carried away in your Apple TV and crank everything up, because it used to come out of the box, making everything HDR at 60 frames per second, it looked like garbage. And when you turned it down to match frame rate and match dynamic range, where it wasn't trying to crank everything up to its maximum, not only do your cables work, but the picture looked better.
Hey,
Don't
Phil,
chase the big number. Yes.
You know, I did not know this until you posted this and put this on the screen for our last session. And I just want to say, I was like, I had no idea. So I would be lying. It was late at night, so I didn't do it like right that second. But the next time I turned on my Apple TV, I went and found all of those settings, and sure enough, Apple had cranked them all up to maximum. I just set all that stuff. And I'm here to say, even using really great HDMI cables, it really made a difference. Everything was much smoother.
Exactly. It makes a massive, massive difference. Don't get carried away with the big fancy numbers. Like I said, the machine makes everything, every movie, and makes it 60p, and movie enthusiasts hate it. So just like we were talking about high frame rate, sometimes high frame rate is not what you want. So those are the kind of things that we need to talk about. So we'll get a little bit more into this, but I see that all the time. That's why I said I like the fact that they put 48 on the box. That tells you that how much can this cable support? And of course, if I want to crank everything up, I can, because the cable can support it. It's not about 444. It's not about 8K. It's not about 420. It's not about 60 frames per second. When you're buying a cable, it is what is the bandwidth support. 48. That's the only thing you need to be concerned with, because after that, then you can start playing with settings in your Blu-ray player and your game system. Okay?
Yeah.
So that was a good conversation that you had while I was gone. Okay.
It was another interesting question that came up in the chat. I think it's related to that. It's Wilmar. Sorry if I butchered your name. Talking about which TV. So LG doesn't support HDR10 plus. Samsung doesn't support Dolby Vision. So where can you watch the highest quality movie? So like Phil said, those are two brands. It's Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Dolby is obviously Dolby, but Dolby Surround, Dolby Atmos, and all of that. And they seem to have the widest support, right? There's more brands of TVs that support Dolby Vision.
Yeah, Dolby Vision is supported by more brands.
Yeah. And Netflix, Disney, iTunes are all Dolby Vision. 10 Plus is open standard. Samsung supports it because the license is more widely available. Amazon Prime supports it.
Samsung made HDR10 Plus because they didn't want to pay for Dolby Vision. Let's be honest. Okay, that's why. Exactly. So they said we can make a certain thing and we'll make it available to everyone. It's almost like the beta versus the VHS. The beta was great, but they wanted to charge everybody for it. So JVC said, "Here's the VHS," and everybody said, "I'll go that way." So so it's two different standards.
Yeah, but both do HDR10 behind it. So if you have a Samsung TV with a Dolby Vision movie, it's still going to play in HDR10. It's still going to be 10-bit in HDR. So that's what's good about it is there's a backwards compatibility into both. There are a few brands that support both standard. The cable really will just pass the information. We don't care as AudioQuest which one we're just sending. We're a highway. But there's a few TVs. Obviously, North America, Panasonic's not present anymore. They have both. There's a few other brands that do both. But you shouldn't worry too much because, like we said, the bit rate and the contrast are super important, and it really depends where you get your movies.
Exactly. That's the nice thing about being a cable company, and for them being a cable company and us being a receiver company, we're format agnostic. We're like, you guys fight it out. We don't really care. We'll just pass it. You guys can battle it out. I will tell you that most TVs now, and I have two expensive projectors sitting here. A lot of TVs and projectors actually aren't even using the internal dynamic metadata anymore. What they do is the projectors and the TVs can actually look at each frame by frame, measure it itself, and then apply it. So a lot of TVs, if you buy an LG or you buy a Sony and you place some HDR10 plus, it was going to ignore the HDR10 plus metadata anyway because it can generate it. You don't have to tell me 2 + 2 is 4. I'm smart enough to figure that out myself, and I'll do it myself. So what you're going to see is these formats are going to be utilized for less expensive TVs that don't have big brains, and they need something to provide them with the information. But most of the higher end TVs now and a lot of the higher end projectors are starting to read the stuff and do the calculations themselves. Some people like kind of the Dolby Vision because the director makes that decision, the colorist makes that decision. So if I play that back on an LG or Sony, the TV will say, okay, well, it's a director. I'll let the director make the decision. But everything else, it's like, get out of the way. I'll do it myself. Now, before I left, we were talking about variable refresh rate. And there's a couple things about this. Isaac just mentioned that when he went into his Apple TV, everything was cranked up. And the reason why they did that was because whenever you look at like Netflix and the menu is at 60 frames per second, and then when you go to the movie and the movie was in HDR or 24 frames per second, the screen would go blank while the source and the display had recommunicated. And Apple was concerned that people would think that was their Apple TV was broken while it was making those things. So what it did was it converted everything to the same resolution in HDR. So when you switch from the menu to Netflix, from the menu to Disney Plus, from that to the Spectrum app or whatever app you were using, there was no blanking of the screen. So they sacrificed picture quality so people would not call them saying, every time I switch from one thing to another, my projector or TV goes blank for 20 seconds, what's going on? So that's why they did that. Well, we were saying that's because you're changing frame rates. But variable refresh rate, guess what you're doing? You're constantly changing frame rates. So another thing that they did with that is what's called quick frame transport and quick media switching. Quick media switching means that as I switch between frame rates, the picture doesn't go blank. So if you're a projector guy like I am, and I'm switching from Netflix to the show, it's not going, the picture doesn't go blank and the projector doesn't go for like 30 seconds before the picture pops up. So, and so you don't have to worry about the blanking of the signal. The next thing is how the signal is delivered. That is quick frame transport. So think of quick frame transport as the computer can draw a frame at a certain, takes it a certain amount of time to draw the frame. So, and then it delivers it to the TV. So imagine you were on an assembly line and you were making a widget. And when you got done making the widget, you would put it into a bucket as it was on the conveyor belt. Well, if you're building the widget really, really fast, and you may finish building it before the next bucket comes up. So you have to hold it until the bucket is there for you to put the thing in. That slows you down. Now, a quick frame transport, think of it as they took the buckets off the conveyor belt and now it's just a conveyor belt. So as fast as I can build the widget, I can put that on the conveyor belt. So I can go really fast, and as fast as I can make them, they go. So there's a benefit when you're a gamer to this. So say Fred and I have the same game system, and same graphics cards, same power, we're running in the same settings, but my TV supports quick frame transport and my receiver supports quick frame transport and his does not. Both computers drew the same frame at the same time. My computer will immediately stick it on that conveyor belt. His computer would have to wait for that next bucket. He comes around the corner, I come around the corner, I see Fred before he sees me, I kill Fred. Okay, so as a gamer, when you combine variable refresh rate, and quick frame transport and high frame rate, that is what gives you the insane amount of gaming advantage for a gamer. So there's multiple things going on. All these things are kind of intertwined, which is actually pretty cool. Okay. So that's one that most people don't think about, but it's a major gaming advantage. There's one more thing that we have to talk about. The thing drew it. It drew the drawing, right? Now it puts it in the bucket. The TV has to display it as quickly as possible. And that is where auto low latency mode comes in. So Fred, why don't you talk about auto latency mode?
Sure. So most TVs have that mode ready. It's usually called game mode, but it needed to be activated manually. Some people didn't know, like Isaac just didn't know the setting existed and then wasn't using 100% of the potential of his system. Or it was just annoying them, like, oh, I got to get the remote and go in the menu and turn it on. Auto low latency mode turns it on as soon as you're sending a game. So if you're using your PlayStation to watch Netflix but then start a game, it will go to auto low latency mode automatically, and then would get out, because the game mode sometimes have different settings. They're not as good for cinema. So it's a really cool feature that, again, can exist. It's not bandwidth intensive like everything else we talked about, but now it's part of the spec, so it's mandatory, and the two new consoles will support it. All displays that will HDMI 2.1 can support this feature, and it's just very, very, very convenient.
Exactly. Now, auto latency mode has existed on game mode has existed on TVs forever.
Right.
Denon and Marantz receivers have had a game mode in them forever. You just probably didn't know about it, and you didn't know that you can actually switch it on. With auto latency mode, if I'm playing Netflix on my game system, all of the video enhancements are on the receiver and on the display. The second I switch to a game, there's a flag that goes to the receiver, and the receiver automatically switches to game mode, and the TV already automatically switches to game mode, and you get lower lag. Oh, another thing that people ask me about that I've noticed too, every step that the signal has to go through before it reaches your eyes adds time. And HD, if you're playing an HD game, an HD monitor or an HD projector or an HD TV will have less game lag than a 4K TV. You know why? Because it doesn't have to upscale. Okay, so upscaling is a step. That is why people go, my game monitor is much faster than my 4K TV, because your game monitor is probably 1440 and you're playing in 1440. It doesn't have to do any upscaling. or your game monitor is in HD and you're playing in HD. It's not doing any upscaling. Your projector that's 4K or your TV that's 4K has to upscale, which increases the amount of lag. This is going to change because remember, the games are playing back now in 4K. So a 4K TV playing back a new Xbox or a new PlayStation does not have to upscale anymore. So that lag issue goes away. So that advantage you had playing an HD game on an HD display goes away if I can plug that same game system in and it delivers at 4K. Now both of them don't have to deal with any kind of scaling and the lag goes down. So that's one of the big advantages of buying these powerful game systems on a 4K display is you eliminate one more step, which will immediately drop the lag. So all of your current TVs, the second you put a high-end game system in and you turn it to 4K, the lag will drop. So I just want to point that out because that's something that most people don't think about when they look at these particular systems. Benefit of auto latency mode, you don't have to do nothing. Okay, you're watching Netflix and it's HD 24, and then all of a sudden you go to a 4K game at 60p or some crazy variable refresh rate. The receiver and the TV will automatically switch, and you will get optimized movie watching, and you'll get optimized gaming automatically, and that is killer. So there's a lot of benefits here that have nothing to do with resolution. Now, there's one more that Isaac is very passionate about that we haven't talked about. It has nothing to do with video at all. It is audio. I know you're passionate about this. Why don't you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I am passionate about audio, and it's not just me. I think that there are a number of George Lucas. The quote that you have on screen, I think, is amazing. I think sometimes we on the audio side might argue it's even more than 50%. We know that there are subtle cues in movies where the music changes before the scene changes, especially in horror movies, and that the ambiance of those tones, those sounds, the creaking and the cracking changes how we feel. And so audio performance isn't just something that is also there. It's a key part of what we think about at AudioQuest. It's even in our name. And so we apply a number of different technologies across the data transmitting portions of HDMI in order to get the best quality of audio as well as the best quality video that we can extract.
Exactly. And we're going to talk a little bit about these cables along the way. But the reason why we brought this up is because one thing that's supported by HDMI 2.1 is enhanced audio return channel. Audio return channel is the ability that if you have a TV to send sound from a TV's internal streaming service or a device connected to the TV back to a receiver or a soundbar. Now, the original audio return channel could pass surround sound, but the surround sound was compressed. Most TVs, you can also use an optical cable to plug the optical cable from the TV to your receiver or soundbar, but most TVs only send stereo down that optical cable. So it can say that your Netflix or your service was in surround, but all you were going to get through your optical cable was stereo. So you needed to use the audio return channel if you wanted surround sound from that app built into the TV. Enhanced audio return channel can support significantly more bandwidth. And that means you can have uncompressed multi-channel, Dolby Atmos, DTS:X Pro, IMAX Enhanced, uncompressed if that app can support it. Another thing that you can do with this is auto lip sync correction. If you have one of the things that people complain about was they went out and got an Xbox or game system and they plug it into an LG and then they use the audio return channel to send that to a receiver and it was lip sync correction, like a bad kung fu overdub, right? And I don't know what you're talking about, kind of thing. And one of the parts of HDMI 2.1 enhanced audio return channel is auto lip sync correction. So if you went into the LG and set it to eARC, and then you turn the receiver to ARC support, and the TV is and the game system is set to ARC, it will automatically correct the lip sync error. So you get No, you get great no lip sync problems. You get much, 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 much higher resolution in surround sound. And HDMI, even ARC can support way more data than an optical cable. An HDMI cable is not only a good video cable, it's actually one of the best audio transfers of digital signal that you can actually use. And we're going to talk about what's inside of this thing in a second. But anything else you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things I know that Fred and I are really proud of at AudioQuest is the attention to detail on the eARC channel itself, and something that we'll talk about more when we get into construction. But I'd be remiss not to point out that as far as we know, we are the only manufacturer who's building this channel. It's its own dedicated data channel in a cable, to the same specification as the primary data channels. And that's important because there's so much more bandwidth available with that construction. It's kind of like taking your favorite sports car and driving along the freeway at 55 miles an hour. It is so effortless that everything else appears effortless by comparison. So we pay a lot of attention at AudioQuest, equal attention to that eARC channel. So for those of you picking up, lucky enough, if you want to bribe me with an Xbox Series X, I'll take one. For those of you lucky enough to get one of those new gaming consoles, you will get to extract the maximum performance of everything in that console graphically, and then whatever your receiver is perfect, whatever you have already from Denon or Marantz, using AudioQuest cables, you'll be able to get the best audio performance as well.
Exactly. Now, there's some other benefits to using eARC. Number one, like I said, if I plug there's two options. I can plug the game system into the receiver, or I can plug the game system directly into the TV. There's a benefit if you can plug it into the TV, plug it into the TV. Number one, if you plug it into the TV, the cable going from the game system to the TV is probably pretty short. Okay. And then you could use a good 18 gigabit cable from AudioQuest to pass the eARC from the TV to the receiver. If I plug that game system into the receiver, I need a 48 gig cable from the source to the receiver and a longer, expensive replacement from the receiver to the TV. So what you have to do is you got to buy two cables if you do it this way, versus two new cables versus two expensive cables versus one really expensive cable and one newer, because they still want you to buy another cable to pass the better eARC support, and we'll talk about that. But it's
and we
less
have an eARC solution too in the new family. We can talk a little later as well.
Exactly. It's less expensive to plug it in. That's all you need to know. It's less expensive to plug it into the TV, and you're gonna get all of the picture quality and all of the sound quality, and it's better. It's the best way to go. Okay. Now, the other thing we got to talk about is even if you think ARC is the devil, you're gonna have to accept it, because ARC used to be connected to what's called CEC, consumer controls your devices. So if I turn the TV on, the receiver would switch, and custom integrators hate that stuff. They don't want the TVs and devices talking. They want to have complete control. Our receivers, you can turn off CEC and then you can go into the sources and turn off CEC. So even if the TV is trying to send commands, the display and the sources will ignore them. So you can get the advantage of eARC without having to deal with the control problems. Most of the 8K content and 4K 120 content you're going to see that's not gaming based are probably going to be sponsored by the TV manufacturers, and they're going to be apps. So say they're doing the Tokyo Olympics, and Frederick mentioned they may do the 100-yard dash at like 120 frames per second. That footage is probably going to be shown through the Sony app or the Samsung app or the LG app built into the TV. So the only way you're going to get the sound from that app to your receiver, if it's done in surround sound with the crowd cheering in Dolby Atmos, is to use eARC. So as much as these installers dislike it, guess what? Get over it. You're gonna have to use it. It's the least expensive. It'll save the customer and you money. It's gonna offer the better performance, and it's going to ensure that you get the best quality from the display's internal apps. All right. So that is something that is really, really important. Now let's talk about the cables, because this is important. the cables themselves look the same on the outside, but they're different on the inside. Because the cable before you, 18 was the target. Now the target is 48. So we're trying to move and increase the bandwidth 2.5 times more data goes down this pipe. Just on actually on 4 of the lines, there's actually more lines in this cable that have nothing to do with 48, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you have to be able to increase it. So if I look inside of this cable, Fred, what's going on in this cable? Tell me what's happening in a normal cable.
Sure. So yeah, so that's an 18 gigabit cable, and you have 3 channels. So those 3 circles with what looks like a weird emoticon, 2 eyes and a small mouth. 2 data pairs and then a ground reference. And you have 3 of them. Each of them could do 6 gigs. So 3 times 6 is 18. The clock pair is that 4th channel, and that EAC HPD, that's your ARC, that's your auto return channel. So if you've ever seen cables with Ethernet, that the idea was that channel was going to do audio return and then Ethernet connection, but everything got a Wi-Fi card built in kind of overnight. And I don't think anybody really uses that for Ethernet. That's really for audio. The last 4 cables are your 5-volt CEC, so your power. So if it's an active cable or we're doing the control we're talking about, they're not in the in one of the 5 channels. They're on their own.
Exactly.
And
so
a new cable, that clock pair becomes a 4th channel. So it's actually going to be equal size and equal construction. And this drawing is not an AudioQuest cable. Even in our 18 gig cable, that EAC pair was actually of equal size and performance. So we made a 6 gig ARC channel because we could. And then in the new cable, that's a 12 gig channel as well. So for us, the 5 data channels are equal size.
Exactly. So in a lot of cables, because everybody's only talking about 18 at the time, or they were only concerned with the video, they used the better gauge and a better quality just for the the cables that passed video, and they basically skimped on everything else. If you try to make all 5 the same quality, guess what's going to happen to the price? It's going to go up. All right. So as you were saying, there was 3 channels for video. All right. But then there was this 4th clock channel. So it was 6 plus 6 plus 6. Channel 0, channel 1, channel 2. That's how they made video. And this clock channel was just to make sure all the ants were aligned and going down the pipe at the same time. Now what happens is instead of 3 lanes of traffic, there's 4 lanes of traffic. So that alone makes 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 equals 24. So we're already at 24 just by making sure that all 3 lanes are of the same quality. Now you got to shove not 6 down those lines, but 12 down those lines. And that is where the challenge becomes, okay? So if you look inside of their cable, this is what the inside of the AudioQuest cable is. So Isaac, why don't you talk about, like you said that a lot of these things are equal size now. So why don't you want to talk about this? Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, so there are a couple of really interesting bits, and I'll just point out that in this illustration, the orange, the green, the yellow, and the blue with their white pair are those FRL pairs, and then the brown and the white are going to represent the eARC in this case. So a couple of things that Fred has already pointed out is equal attention to those channels. So each of those channels treated the same, especially notable is the eARC, because that's, as Phil explained, expensive, and most manufacturers aren't going to spend equal amount of time, energy, and cost on a channel that requires much less bandwidth. However, one of the major revelations that we had at AudioQuest has nothing to do with the 48 spec at all. If you look at the other wire that's next to those twisted pairs, that's often referred to as a drain. However, the way that it's connected in an HDMI, AudioQuest recognized that these function much more like 5 little balanced or XLR cables. As such, we are the only manufacturer to date to deploy an equal amount of attention to that ground reference. And that's going to give you substantially better reduction of noise, which means less distortion, less harm done to your audio and video signals.
Yeah, and that's a big point. Because if you look at a cable and you cut them open, they're not going to be the same. So so first thing is you got to have the 4 video signals better. That has to happen, and they have to be higher quality to pass the video. Then we have all those other things we just talked about, such as the eARC channel. those, if you're not, if because of you could have, if you upgrade those too, that's going to increase the cost. And then of course the materials that you use is also going to increase the cost. Now we talked about the fact that at first it was 6 going down each lane, so we added that 4th lane, so now we have 24. Now we're trying to shove more data down those same lanes. So how did you guys do that?
Sure, and what's on screen is a good example of how it's been done before. So on a network cable, a Cat6 cable can do 1 gigabit of data on 100 meters. A Cat6a can do 10 gigabits of data on the same distance. And if you see the difference, each pair is twisted more tightly, so it's called the pitch. So a greater pitch, there's more material per centimeter per inch, and that's noise rejection geometry, and it's something at AudioQuest we pay attention to our speaker cable or analog cable, everything. Geometry always matter. Well, the new HDMI 2.1 spec has a tighter pitch geometry, which allows to double the bandwidth on each twisted pair. So we're adding an extra lane of the highway, and we're doubling the speed on each lane, and that's how we're getting from 18 to 48.
Yeah.
It's also one of the reasons that you see across manufacturing, regardless of whether it's AudioQuest or somebody else, that's one of the reasons that the price goes up with 48 cables. There is literally more material, as Fred said, per inch per twisted pair.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a big point. You're using better gauge on, if you use better gauge on all of the different signal wires, then you twist them more using more cable, you know, and then you guys also use different types of wire than anybody else uses. That kind of explains part of the difference. Now, a lot of this too we got to talk about too is noise. Like Isaac, you always say a cable's job is to do no harm, right? To just magically pass the signal as pure as possible from point A to point B. And we get people bring this up to me a lot. Digital cables either work or they don't because it's ones and zeros. And I used to think this way too, and it kind of logically makes sense. If you don't see the 1 or 0, then that means the cable's not working. So neither it works or it isn't. It's like a light switch, but it really isn't like that. And you can actually see that in testing. So DPL Labs, these are actually from DPL Labs, are one of the companies that actually test HDMI cables. And when we talked about the multiple lanes of traffic, this here shows you the different lanes. So what you want is, see how beautiful, this is called like an eye mask test. You want it to be smooth and undistorted. A lot of cables, as they get longer and longer and longer, depending on the quality of the channels, it starts to distort. And that distortion has an effect on what it sounds like and what it looks like. Hopefully the TV can decipher the fact that that is what the cable is trying to relay to you, but it may not be correct. Now, the more you add, the more and the longer the distance and the bigger the data, the more those lanes start to warp and distort, okay? That is distortion, and that is noise. Eventually, it gets to the point where there's so much noise that the cable cannot differentiate what the heck you're talking about, and the picture goes blank. So it isn't the fact that there's no signal, it's just that the signal is so corrupt. I don't know what you're trying to tell me. Okay.
Well, exactly. So what you're showing there is great, Phil, that, you know, it's not ones and zeros. In this case, it's current. And if you look at the chart, it's about between, you know, plus 300 millivolts or minus 300. So it's actually an up and down or plus and minus. It's not a 1 or a 0. That's the software. That's the binary encoding. But there's no digital electron. There's no digital cable. It's all analog communication that's interpreted in digital at the end, right? Does it plus 300 millivolt, minus 300 millivolt? In this case, looking at it, the computer says, I don't know. If he's not sure, he's going to interpolate and guess. But you know, that top left one is, I have no clue, and it stops working. That's why people think it works or it doesn't. But there's no digital communication in the cable. It's all analog. It's a different language. But there's no digital electrons, analog electrons. They're just electrons. They're picking, the cable is an antenna, picks up noise, and at one point it gets so fuzzy.
And this is the noise. It's a wonderful visual representation of the noise that is in fact picked up along the length of a cable. And something I know we'll get back to, because everybody on this panel, right, is a projector enthusiast, but one of the mistakes, or the misconceptions I should say, people make about long length active cables is they don't use amplifiers to boost signal. Rather, they're using filter chipsets in order to understand what type of noise and distortion would normally be picked up along this material, along this length, so I can reject that, so I can get back to understanding what type of signal was passed originally. So everything about long length, regardless of AudioQuest or another manufacturers, understanding that noise and distortion is the primary enemy of long distance communications.
Exactly. And we have to get a point across too. There's 4 lanes of traffic. If one lane gets backed up, the freeway stops. Okay.
Yep.
So you could have 3 lanes working perfectly, and if one lane gets too noisy, it needs all 4 pieces of information to make the picture. So if one goes down, it doesn't matter if the 3 are still passing, the picture goes away. All right. All 4 have to send the signal enough that the CV can decipher it. Enough of the signal that the CV can decipher it. So an active cable, I didn't know this. I thought it was like it's amplifying it and pushing it down or pulling it through. They go, no, it's just reducing the amount of noise so the display knows what the heck the signal is trying to relay. So there's a couple of approaches that they've been working on. The first thing is the tighter tolerances means better signal transfer. The next thing is we'll talk about the type of material that they use, and also the type of conductor that they use. So talk about the reason why you guys use solid core conductors.
Sure. I like visual metaphors, and what you have on screen makes it really easy to understand. It doesn't matter how much voltage is applied to a cable, any amount, and that's that little 300 or minus 300 that Fred was just discussing, creates something that's known as the antenna effect. And so each of these conductors then generates and receives electromagnetic and radio frequency interference. So one of the primary building blocks, or core ingredients, if you will, of AudioQuest is to use solid core conductors whenever possible. That minimizes this strand interaction. If you imagine what perfect timing, if a traditionally built or conventional HDMI cable doesn't have just the 19 conductors, it's the 19 conductors made up of many dozens of strands each. So most of your HDMI cables have literally hundreds of fields of distortion inherent to its own design. The AudioQuest cable minimizes that. You have only those 19 solid core conductors. That allows you to take it down to only those 19 individual electromagnetic fields. The other thing that I think is really important, if I can touch on briefly while we have those images up, is while we've shown this a few times, what we haven't discussed is that every single conductor is controlled for directionality. So we make sure, as all of these 19 conductors are extruded through a die, we determine the directionality or the orientation of the leaving of that metal on the surface, and then we orient all of those in the same direction. And that includes the stuff that we don't talk that much about, like the CEC, the power, as well as all the other control functions. So by controlling for directionality and keeping all of those individual conductors as solid core, we minimize most of the noise and distortion that plagues conventional HDMI cables.
Exactly. Now, the big thing I want to get across about this, and the reason why I wanted them to talk about it, is AudioQuest stuff you pay a premium for, just like a Marantz piece. And that why? Because we decide to go, both companies go it their own way. So, for example, on a Marantz, we could use an op amp to do all of our signal boosting, but you don't have much control about that. You're limited to the quality of the op amp. So we decide to use individual components and make HDAMs, which means more components means you pay a premium over a normal AVR. Okay. The same thing applies with these HDMI cables. They could go out and buy copper stranded wire that everybody else makes, or they could go out and go their own way. We can argue about whether their way is the right way and how many Schmeckmans are in the spectronic spectralizer or whatever, but the fact is the way they do stuff is different. All the different channels are the same gauge. The ARC channel is the same gauge. They're using common solid core instead of stranded. It makes it cost more. If you cut the wire, it's different. Just like if you lift the case, the lid off of a Marantz, even though it's a 100-watt receiver, it doesn't look like anybody else. And when you go your own way, it increases the cost. So Fred has an analogy I love about because he's Canadian, you know he loves his freaking poutines and his mac and cheese. So why don't you bring that up?
Sure. Well, because what you're talking about are the ingredients, right? A recipe, and the analogy that Phil's alluding to is mac and cheese. I can have, Blue Box Kraft Dinner. You can buy it in bulk at Costco or the big box store near you for less than $1. And don't get me wrong, if you're hungry, it tastes good and it's okay, and it's food. It's using cheese-like powder and regular pasta, and you put a bit of milk. My thing is to put a little bit of ketchup. Some other people put hot dogs, but it's very, very basic. But that same mac and cheese baseline, if I make my own pasta, I get strong cheddar or blue cheese, or the local pub near me, they put brisket in it, and some shiitake mushrooms. It's still mac and cheese, but the ingredients are better, and my experience is better. It tastes better. It'll cost more. That plate of mac and cheese at my pub is over $20 versus $1 at Costco. But the ingredients are better, my experience is better. And it's the same thing when designing a cable or designing any product. The way you do it and what you use to do it is super, super important. And same thing with poutine. You don't go to McDonald's to get the McDonald's French fries and their powdered gravy. There's a right way to do poutine. You can text me after. I'll let you know.
Exactly. So quality of the type of components you use, the sourcing of the components you use, and can impact the price. It's just the way it is. So another one that they do is people ask them about is silver. These guys are maniacs. They want to use silver sometimes.
Yeah.
So why do you guys choose silver sometimes?
Silver is a really interesting material, and you have this wonderful quote from Lehigh University that essentially uses silver to define conductivity. And at every opportunity, whenever this comes up, I always like to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge that there are other exotic materials out there. And what makes silver different than metal X or metal Y that isn't copper, to be clear, is that silver and copper are the most linear metals, and silver becomes more linear at higher frequencies. So silver sounds best and does a better job of dissipating noise and distortion at high frequencies. So the interesting thing is it's really not about the primary signal, it's about getting rid of the noise along the surface of the cable wherever possible. When we have, because Phil, as you said, this stuff costs real money, right? Let's acknowledge that silver is not free. Working with it is expensive. 99.99999 pure fine silver extruded multiple times is more expensive than commodity grade silver. And so as the customer, as the dealer, as the project itself has more money for increasing levels of performance, AudioQuest HDMI cables are going to deploy increasing amounts of silver plated copper all the way up to our flagship line of Dragon, where every one of the primary data pairs and its ground reference are made out of solid silver core. So it is a perfect surface. Silver is a very, very fragile exotic material, but for people who care the most about performance, it's a new level, an all-out assault for those big-time systems.
I told Isaac that it's so much silver, I'm going to wear it as a chain at CES next year. So give me one. I'm going to walk around with my thick chain of silver because there's so much silver in this thing. So he promised me he's going to give me
I'm gonna if you promise to wear it like this, we're gonna have to meet up. I think Jim, he was having a great time on the call the other night. I think he might have even agreed to wear some Firebird if I got him some Firebird. So I might throw that to Jim in the process.
I think that was Frederick. He wants
that was Frederick. That's right.
Yeah, he wants to basically wear a suit of armor.
Exactly.
There we go.
So we talk about, different materials instead of strands. Solid core costs more.
Yes.
Different materials, going from copper to different levels of silver, being silver plated copper all the way to 100% silver costs more. Using equal quality for the ARC channel, because you guys care about audio, right? Costs more. Okay. Then there's even the shielding is different, and that costs more. Correct?
That's exactly right. And you've put three really good cables on the screen for us to take a look at from left to right: Pearl 48, Cinnamon 48, and Carbon 48. And these are, I think, for the majority of our dealers and customers, and correct me if I'm wrong, Fred, I think this is the heart of our line of HDMI for many people, in particular Cinnamon. So not only will you see, as you already alluded to, Phil, the increasing amounts of silver-plated copper in those primary conductors, but you'll also notice the additional metal layer, the foil shield around those primary pairs in Cinnamon. When you get to Carbon, you'll see a carbon-loaded PVC material added yet again around those individual twisted pairs. And these are enhancing levels of noise dissipation. So we're trying to prevent as much of that, bombardment of 5G, 4G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, all the stuff we have in our home. Those systems are now trying to minimize that outside noise coming into the cable.
Exactly. So all of this stuff, like I said, we could talk about it. We just wanted to let you guys know that there's difference of cables. And the interesting thing about it is their 48 cables are non-active cables. They're not using active, they're not using optical. It is actually their 48 cables. How long can you go with these cables? What's the length of these cables now? What's the
5
maximum
meters.
length?
5 meters.
15 feet, a little bit more than 15 feet. And it's done non-active, just with quality of construction materials. Now, one thing that we always point out is we do have the ability to test this. On our receivers, we've always had some sort of HDMI diagnostics tool. This is not for the faint of heart. If you're scared of menus and you don't like playing with menus and you don't, leave it alone. But if you're an installer or you're someone that's technically savvy and comfortable, you can actually utilize the HDMI diagnostics tool to test the quality of your cables. Because if I have a 3-meter cable coming in on one side and a 5-meter cable coming out the other side, I am now looking at an 8-meter cable. All right. So a lot of times the quality of the cables starts to matter more as you have one going in and one going out. And this allows you to test your cables to make sure that the cables can support. We test up to 40, which is the maximum that a current TV or display can support. So you can actually verify your cables. Now, let me ask you a question. Your cables now are, why don't you have an active 48 or an optical 48 cables that are longer than 5 meters currently? Can you explain to me that?
Fred, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so first of all, the HDMI 48 came out last week, so they're already pretty new.
I want one now.
We are looking at solutions. We haven't found the right solution. We never strive to be first. We happen to be one of the first to come out with HDMI 48. But with active, we are beholden to manufacturer partners, and we haven't found the right partner with the right product that we'd be happy to use in our solution that can do 48. So we have active solutions, and we'll show them in a second. The Cherry Cola being our optical solution. There's just that chipset is limited to 18. Once there's a replacement chipset that can do 48, we'll be happy to release the product, and customers will be happy to purchase the product. It's not ready yet, and we don't want to sell you a half-baked product. Those cables are usually installed in the walls and are very difficult to replace. So you want something that's reliable, that's high performance, and that we're happy to put our name on.
Exactly. So we had mentioned before that you should be plugging your game system directly into the TV, right? If you do that, the cable is no problem, 2 meters, 3 meters, right? Then you need that long cable to go from that TV in the wall, over the ceiling, down into your rack, like what I have. And that is where their long distance 18 gigabit cables come into play. Now, a couple of things about these that I want to point out, is number one, the eARC channel, that's one of the upgrades this year, is of the same quality as the other 4 lanes. So if you're trying to send signal back from that game system to your receiver, the quality is going to be excellent, right? The next thing is it passes ARC and it passes eARC. If I go out and I use an HD-Base-T extender and I wanted to pass eARC through HD-Base-T through a Cat6, it will cost you more for that extender kit than what this cable costs. All right, you're talking thousands. Most of the ones that can support just ARC cost at least $500 to $600. I think I saw one that I just tested that can surpass eARC, and it was like $900. Okay, so a lot of times this is the least expensive way of getting that signal long distances when it comes to enhanced audio return channel is going to be using a physical cable like one of
And
these.
if I can touch on that for just a moment, I know, again, speaking for product development and Fred here, we're really proud of the fact that our 18 gig models, which is what you're showing on screen, will absolutely still pass eARC, because we were already fanatical in our devotion to creating as much bandwidth as possible on these channels. So you will still, even if you use one of these, get the full benefit of the current uncompressed version of eARC. So you can deploy these in and feel very confident that you're going to get the most out of those new game consoles connected to a new TV.
Yeah. So I have a really long 20-meter Cherry Cola in my spot, but right now the Cherry Cola, there's the optical in the Cherry Cola, right? But the eARC is independent of that, right? Isn't there
It's
another
copper.
line? It's copper.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
because
copper with carbon loaded PVC. So in the regular line, it would be called carbon or vodka. So in terms of performance, it's a great sounding optical cable.
Yeah, so that's the reason why you pay premium. Because remember, even if you buy an optical cable, this optical cable is going to cost more than a lot of the other guys. But the fact is, there's the optical fiber in the line, and then there's copper in the line. So so that's one of the reasons why you may pay a premium. We can argue about whether you need it or how you need it or whatever, but there's a reason why it costs what it does. All right. So I just
Can
always
you
want
put
to
my
point that out.
favorite slide in the world on, Phil, what you should always be putting in your walls if you're running a long cable?
Oh yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The best way to make your system 100% future-proof is one of these. Ta-da! You talk
Conduit.
about buy once, cry once.
Yes.
Run a piece of conduit, because I have an older Cherry Cola and I'm trying to figure out how do I pull the new one. So and I'm like, dang it! Every time, so conduit is always a good thing. So I'm sure there's tons and tons of questions out there. So let's get to some of these questions, and let's spend about, if it's okay with the with Frederick and Isaac, let's spend another 20 minutes to a half an hour. Jim.
So
Okay.
we have some questions, and one of them is on CEC, and it's going to take me a minute to get through this because he asked two different versions. So customer or dealer has an OLED Panasonic GZ950 connected to an AVC X8500 using ARC for home theater. But when I turn the TV on, the Denon turns on. And then the sound comes out of both the Denon and TV speakers at the same time. If I put the Denon into standby and then power it on manually, the TV correctly switches. Will this be fixed in the AHDMI 2.1 board upgrade? His follow-up is, if I switch TV from live TV to ARC HDMI input, my NVIDIA Shield powers up, but the TV remote doesn't control the NVIDIA box. But if I switch back to TV Live, then it works fine when selected ARC HDMI input. So you want to dig into that whole CEC thing a little bit?
Oh yeah. So I'm trying to actually bring up my Marantz receiver on my network. I'm not sure if I can get to it. The first thing is, right now the receiver defaults with CEC on, consumer the CEC on. You can go into the receiver and tell it to take the ARC and ignore the CEC. Turn off consumer CEC control in the receiver, and when you turn on the TV, the receiver will ignore it. Then go into your sources and turn off CEC control. Every single source that you have, your Apple TV, your Roku, your Blu-ray player, they all have that setting. Turn it off. And then when you do that, even though the TV's sending out commands, your entire system will ignore them. Okay, so that's the thing. Some TVs allow you to separate ARC from CEC, but many TVs will not. A lot of them still will not, especially I know LGs will not. So when you turn on ARC or eARC, the CEC or Sony calls it Bravia Sync, and LG has a name for it, and Sony and Samsung has a name for it. It will be engaged, but you could tell the receiver, go into the HDMI settings and tell it to ignore control. And if it ignores control, no matter what you're doing with your TV, the receiver will completely ignore it. So I think that's what's going on, is the receiver is set to follow the commands, and all of your devices are set to send commands. So turn it all off, and then you'll be okay.
By the way, just to let you know, if a device receives an update, a firmware update, they may change the setting again. I had a friend that had that happen with his DirecTV box, turned his CEC back on, and every time his DirecTV box started recording something, everything came on.
Exactly. So
it took a while to troubleshoot that one. Frederick, you're up.
Yes, sir. Just a couple of other ones. We were talking about, and that's the million-dollar question, I think, from Karsten, about distortion in the cables. What's the story about distortion when you're using optical cables, though?
Ooh, do you want to talk about galvanic isolation, Freddie?
Absolutely. So you're entirely right to think optical will solve a lot of the problems of a metal cable because it does not act like an antenna. That's the galvanic word that Isaac just used. So it will not pick up RF and not pick up EMI and will not radiate it either. But fiber itself being glass, and the lenses we're using right now are glass too, there's distortion in glass. That's why you can spend a few hundred to a few $1,000s on a better Canon or Nikon lens. And that distortion is called diffraction. So a better quality fiber will diffract the light less and to still create, because that 1 and 0 is a pulse in terms of an optical cable, but that pulse could become fuzzy the longer you go down the wire, and those wires can be very, very long in the case of fiber, and diffraction will affect performance. Also, because there's metal as well, most HDMI cables are hybrids with the metal we talked about. You want to have noise rejection, and that's that carbon layer I mentioned before the end, because there's electronics on both ends. There's a transmitter chip that will receive the HDMI signal that's meant to go down a metal cable, turn it into light, and then at the other end, a receive that will take that light and turn it into electricity. Well, noise can couple on those ends as well, and that's why we're not the first one, and we're not jumping on the first chip that's come to market. We want to get a very, very high performance chip that doesn't pick up a lot of noise that way. Because even though the fiber will not pick up any noise, those other wires running alongside can, and we want to minimize that to have a cable that meets the performance that we want. It's true that, in audio, if you want to use Toslink versus coax, people say they sound different. It shouldn't be. Yeah, Toslink doesn't pick up noise, but you got to convert the sound to Toslink and then deconvert it from Toslink to PCM, and that will affect the sound as well. So there's no perfect solution. We don't live in the perfect world. What's written on the page might sound perfect, but then when you experiment, it's not. So there's a different kind of distortion. We strive, and Cherry Cola is not it's not the cheapest fiber HDMI on the market, but we believe it's one of the best because we paid attention to all those different problems that can happen.
And that's a big point. And that's a big point here, was people say, well, theoretically, I shouldn't hear the difference because it's just optical.
Right.
You're not hearing the optical. Even if they use the same quality optical, what you're hearing is the converting system, the one that converted it to optical and reconverted it back from optical to HDMI.
Yeah.
That is what's going to make them sound different. Okay. So a lot of times it's the little tips at the end that have the conversion and the deconversion is what is going to make them sound different. And that is what's going to separate. Fiber is not that expensive. Like, they can make a little short fiber cable, but it would cost almost as much as the super long one, because the fiber in the middle is cheap. The conversion systems on the ends are what cost the money. Okay. Yeah. And that is what's going to separate two fiber cables. Those little tips at the end, not the copper, not the optical in the middle. The optical is cheap. The little things on the outside, on the edges, are what makes them really, really expensive. The other thing that we didn't cover is we use a lot of AudioQuest, one, because it sounds good, and two, just for our own personal sanity. Jim does 50. I mean, when normal years, 50 shows easily between CEDIA, CES, Best Buy events, trade show, we do dealer events, Rocky Mountain Audio Show. We are constantly plugging and unplugging these cables, and quality cables can survive that. There's some differences in the construction. So part of it has to do, even the tips are different. So part of it means the reliability means it's not going to fail, and I can plug them in 50 or 60 times. But even the tips that they use to connect the copper or the conductors to the tip could impact it too, right, Isaac?
Absolutely. And one of the things that's really interesting about this picture here is it doesn't just show what I think is kind of obviously a different in design ethos, the AudioQuest with its solid, solid shield, it's a solid connector bit there. When you look at brand X, that metal foil there, that crinkly shield, it's not just sort of unsightly, it also is non-linear. So all that work we were talking about, dissipating noise, even if this brand has done everything else right, all the way up to the connector, now it's inducing all sort of nasty vertices of noise. And from personal experience and public discourse, we know that these cables fail more often. That difference in build quality is not just how it looks and how it sounds, it's also how reliable it is in terms of its use. And you may not be like Jim, you may not have to install and uninstall an HDMI cable 50 or 60 times within a year, but I think it's really nice knowing when you're purchasing something like that, that's the type of reliability. It's like purchasing an F-150 Raptor. I don't know how many guys and gals are taking that truck off road and tearing up tree stumps, but it is really cool to know that you can, when you're going down to Costco to load it up with more stuff.
Build construction makes a difference, okay?
Mhm.
And that alone, quality, there's difference in the wire, and the construction is built different. You pay a premium. We can, just like with Marantz sounds different than Denon. To make it sound different is because of how it's built. Those components cost a premium. It's up to you to determine if you like the Marantz sound or the Denon sound. They use solid core. Their construction is different. Their materials are different. It's up to you to listen and experiment with those cables and make the proper decision. But there's a reason why. So not all optical HDMIs are going to sound the same. Not all HDMI cables are going to sound the same or going to look the same because of some of the things that we've talked about today. But we just want let you know that there's a reason why you pay a premium. Correct?
Yes. If the customers look out for new products, the box has been shown. All those ingredients are called out on the box. So we have really big icons that make it really easy, that you'll see the percentage of silver if it's a model above Forest and above, on the E-arc and the regular data pair, the shielding. And a lot of people think of shield as something that's a hard wall, a hard surface. You're Captain America and you're stopping bullets. You're not. You're absorbing. A shield is a sponge. We just try to make our shield as linear as possible, as Isaac said, and do more with carbon-loaded material. We use graphene on our top models. We do a lot of different ingredients. Those are on the box. They're levels from 1 to 6, I should say, that will define how many of those levels of technology. So the directionality is a level 1. The better metal or the carbon is level 2 and 3, and the graphene will bring you to 5 and then 6 with DBS. So it's easy to see what you're paying for and getting those ingredients because we put the recipe on the box. Okay. And that reliability, we put the limited lifetime warranty logo on the front of the box. We always took care of that. We were always a great company that if something break, if you have a lightning cable that broke, Phil, we would replace it most of the time, unless you dog ate it. But we put it on the box now. So
exactly. So can you read Samit's question, because this is important?
Yeah, what is the maximum resolution, bitrate, and color sub-sampling that the Pearl 48 support in a 15-meter length?
Yeah, 15-meter Pearl 48 does not exist. It is Pearl 18, but it is an 18 gigabit per second cable, so you can do 4K 60 in HDR. You can do some 8K content in 30 frames, but that will be 8-bit, and there's not that much content out there that way. So 4K 60 would be the highest performance there. That Pearl 18 15 meters an active cable, so we'll have that longer head on the TV or projector side. It does full E-arc. As Isaac mentioned, we've put the same level of care on that EARC channel, but it will not do 48 in a 15 meters. The longest Pearl Pearl 48 will be a 5 meter. And we make that in the Forest and a Cinnamon as well in 5 meter, but anything above that currently is an 18 gigabit solution.
As far as we know, we are the only manufacturer today that has a passive 48 gigabit per second cable up to 5 meters. That is a very, very long length to transmit that kind of bandwidth. So if you have the opportunity to put something closer up to 5 meters, you could get the 48 gigs bandwidth.
Yeah, and that's a big point. Remember I told you at the beginning to look at 48? That was the thing you need to be concerned with, 48, 48, 48, 48. When you see 48, if you don't see 48, it doesn't support 48. Okay, if you see 48 at the end, or you see 48 on the box, it supports 48 at that length. And 48 will give you everything that the standard can do. So that means when it comes to 8K, by the way, 8K 60, there is no 8K 60 444 uncompressed standard for HDMI 2.1. For uncompressed 8K at 60p with 12-bit color, it uses 420. 4K 120, there is a 444 standard for 12-bit, which is 48. So basically, if you have 48, I don't care. It supports the maximum that the standard can support, period. And that's why I said look for the 48 gigabit per second bandwidth number, not how many 444s or how many frames per second, because that could be bent based on the other numbers. It's all the numbers combined gives you the mathematics. Okay.
All right, so Carson has another great one. I've heard that the current Denon and Marantz AVR or AVCs have many HDMI 2.1 functions on the 18 gigabits HDMI interfaces, as well as the 40 gigabits interfaces, except for the bandwidth itself. Do they all have DSC as well?
DSC is only on built into the cable, the input. Basically, there's two chips inside of this receiver. One switches all of the 18 gigabit stuff, and one is the chip for the 48. So there's two chips in it. That the chip that does 18 does everything but bandwidth and DSC. Okay. If you want bandwidth, the 40 bandwidth and the digital stream compression, you got to use the 2.1 chip that's in the receiver. So DSC is part of that chip.
All right, the next question is for Isaac and Fred. How does the monocore affect the flexibility? Scott is asking.
So solid core is always a bit more solid, so it's a bit more stiff, and that's why Isaac alluded that whenever possible we use solid core. Some of our products are not. The lightning cable we talked about, because it gets manipulated a lot, that's not a solid core cable. It is a multi-strand. The strands are bigger. A regular 14.2 kind of in-wall install, your basic installer cable, we use better material, but it's not solid core. It'd be really, really hard to pull. In an HDMI, it's always solid core. The new 48 makes the cable a little stiffer because there's more material per centimeter or per inch we talked about. Now, is it a stick or a rod that you can't bend like a giant fire hose? No. Just make sure that you buy the right length. Everybody tries to get the shortest cable possible, and that's true. But if you're between 0.75 and 1.5 and it's really, really tight, give yourself some slack. Don't break an HDMI connector in the back of your panel. That gets to be an expensive oopsie. A little longer is always better than a little shorter. The cables will be a little more stiff. There's some very, very thin cables out there that are super flexible, but the performance is usually rarely there.
Exactly. Okay. Next question.
Okay, somebody is asking, that's a great one as well. Any protection features possible in HDMI cables to prevent, for example, spurious voltage feedback back and forth on unconnected devices?
Let's chat about that for a second. That's a great question, and this is where we get to raise our hands and say we are the tail of the dog of the industry. We are only there to connect devices. What you're talking about is potentially adding some sort of circuit or failsafe, and that starts adding all kinds of problems for the guys at Denon and Marantz, at JVC, at Sony, at LG. And this is where we have to rely on all of our communications. It's why we work together so frequently to make sure that the chipsets themselves have this built in. Copper is just copper. We don't have a way without altering the data, which we are fundamentally opposed to doing, changing that signal to stop that. The good news is that those types of issues are extremely rare and were more predominant many years ago. I think Phil, Jim, and our team at AudioQuest can all attest to those types of issues happen almost none now with modern components, with better chipsets that have more of those safety built into the receiver itself, built into the TV, built into the game console. So you shouldn't really have to be concerned about that going forward.
But if you're scared, it doesn't hurt to turn off your component when you unplug it. That's
Exactly.
usually what I try to do, especially on my stuff at home. You use your hard-earned money, just turn it off before you unplug it.
Mhm.
And if you want to dust behind your component once in a while, it's not a bad thing to do either.
Exactly.
And by the way, the last bit on flexibility, just so you know, is Freddie and I are both using the new HDMI 48 cables in order to do our computer setups currently. And while I would love to tell you that my home office is huge, it is not. So there are plenty of twists and turns of cables in order to make these connections work. And it's just as it is a touch stiffer due to the extra material. But I promise you, if you have deployed any AudioQuest HDMI cables in the past, you will find these to be comparable.
Okay.
I think we did it. We went through all the questions. Yay.
That was awesome.
Right we only a half an hour. So thank you guys again. It's always a pleasure to have this crew together because the amount of stuff that we go through and what we learn is, I think it's fun and it's good. We need to do more of these. It's fun having other vendors come and manufacturers come and talk about their particular products that they serve, that they make. So thank you guys again for coming. Thank everyone for your support. And hopefully you learned a little bit more about HDMI and the fact that there's differences in quality of cables and what the benefits are of HDMI 2.1. So take care, and we will talk to everyone soon. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Have a nice weekend.